Sometimes I sit back and wonder what it all means. What seems to be my greatest weakness, along with pride and self-esteem, cause I look too deep in what means nothing. These life, these trees.
Lindelof's initial inspiration for The Watchmen came after he read about the Tulsa massacre and Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations piece for The Atlantic. And he realized he'd never heard about it before. And the only way he could learn was to ask questions and listen. As I began to express my emotional experience with learning about Tulsa to people of color, they were sort of like, yeah, I've known about this my entire life.
Yeah.
Lindelof says that was my way of saying, I don't know what I'm talking about, but I want to talk about this. Can we talk about this? So,
right.
I think that is true. White people think when they find out about something, it's new information.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's the biggest problem to me, besides like the idea of who it's for and who it serves. Because the other thing that bothered me was when he was saying that the purpose behind writing something should be, why do you care, why this, and why now? And all that seems self-serving around his curiosity instead of the community it serves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like the biggest thing for me whenever this topic comes up, where it's like, okay, you know, sure, even if I'm writing for another cultural group that's Black but outside of my own culture, it's still something that require research and respect and stuff like that. But I have to be cognizant of how it would be received to that group, not just, wow, it's something fascinating, interesting to me, so I'd like to explore that. So I don't know. For me, that's the biggest bump. But what do you think, Jazz?
I don't know. I feel like this article is just so short, and it's like the perfect thing for white people to be like, oh, well, then I don't have to have any actual background or experience in this to jump into anything. And I think that the Watchmen Room was much more in depth than what this article is like able to portray, because I enjoyed the show.
I thought it was a great show.
Yeah, and I think that there was a lot of authenticity of Black voices in that show. And the way this article is framed is like Lindelof was able to pull this magical feat off of like writing something that he didn't know, but there were like Black writers there that wrote that stuff. So it's like kind of crazy to me to like frame it this way and then give all these people the perfect excuse to just not invest as wholeheartedly as they should in like telling a story.
I think that until very recently, white people were the only ones that were telling everyone's stories for the most part. And it's only very recent where people are in positions of power where we really can tell our own stories in a mainstream sort of way. I think we've always told our own stories, and we don't need to rely, I personally don't believe we don't need to rely on any sort of established power structure to tell our stories. But in recent years, we've been invited into those white spaces to finally tell our stories instead of having white people write our stories. So you're going to get that backlash. But you know, I agree that, because I think it's a double-edged sword. I think that a lot of times, if you are a person of color, you are sort of trapped into only telling stories that are about that, whereas white people can tell anyone's story.
Right.
and
that's like, my problem with it.
I have, like, I one of my friends that's a writer, but she went on a staffing meeting for a popular show at that time. And she was basically pitching her ideas on all the characters as a huge ensemble show. But basically the showrunner just wanted her to write the Asian character. Like, because she's Asian, she's sort of put into a box where she just has to write for the Asian person, which is extremely absurd to me. And, you know, she is actually Chinese. The Asians on that show were Korean. They were, you know, from Korea. And she is from America. So her experiences as an Asian American aren't even remotely close to someone who grew up in Korea, but you're expecting this person to write for the Asian character. I think like I said, I think it's a double-edged sword because white people have the freedom to do whatever they want. And as a person of color, you're kind of roped into writing stories about people that look like you. And I don't want that to be true. I think that anyone should be able to write a story if you do it with care and research. Like he said, like as a Black woman, I don't want to only have to write stories about Black women. Like that is extremely limiting and unfair to me. And I might want to write a story about, a man or someone else, a non-binary person. Like I feel like you don't have to only write things that are your experiences, but I do think that until recently, white people, I still think it's now, even now, I think white people are the only ones allowed to write anything. Like Damon Lindelof has the power to go to HBO and be like, I want to write this show about Black injustice. And they're like, oh, cool. But if I come into HBO and I'm like, you know what, I want to write a story about Japanese internment camps. They're probably going to look at me and be like, bitch, why? So I feel like, honestly, I think that white people are the only ones who really, in the mainstream, are allowed that freedom to write whatever they want, and everyone else you're sort of beholden to writing stories about people that are like you.
I think
Yeah.
the only reason I'm sort of against it is because of staffing. So, like, even with the most amount of attention to detail and care, when it comes to, for instance, a Latinx story, I desire to see more depiction in that space, or with Indigenous people. I would love to see more. However, it would be an injustice to just continue to tell that story, to do visibility on that side of things and not behind the scenes, because we all know what the percentages are looking like in terms of representation in that regard. So if people keep telling other people's stories without empowering people to get the opportunity to do that for themselves, then you just got the same cycle of exclusion. So there's that aspect, although I completely agree with the idea of having the privilege to just tell a good research story, and the ability, especially for a writer's room, to pull together other parties to include their voice still in that space. But when you look at the way that pay is broken down, it's still going to be a certain percentage, the 1%, making profit off of all these other people's stories. Well, I say the 1%, but in this context, you know what I mean? So especially when it deals with situations of trauma or suffering or history or injustice, it does seem opportunistic for a white creative to then be the lead on that project. So that's my thing, is it's kind of disproportionate in that way.
Yeah. As I'm thinking about it, the whole thing is kind of like colonialist in its construct.
Exactly.
You know, it's like white people love to discover and to feel like they're being educated about something more than they care about telling a story that's cathartic for anyone. Especially the people whose trauma they're just like repatriating over and over again. So the fact that he like read this article and was like, this is horrible, people should know.
I know, it's funny. Yeah, like I said, I don't think white people don't think anything exists until it's just like the whole myth about discovering America. How can you discover some shit? There's already people there. Like it's like nothing exists until it becomes in view of a white person, which, like, I'm glad a lot of white people probably didn't know that exists. And a lot of white people watch The Watchmen, and maybe their view on reparations changed, or their empathy with Black people largened. I don't know. So it's sort of like, it's annoying that this has to happen, but it kind of does have to happen because white people are the majority, and unfortunately, and they still control the power structures. So unless we just completely have our own separate power structure, completely devoid of them, which I'm all for. But if you're not for that and want to be integrated, then you kind of have to have white people aha moments where they first discovered racism for the first time. Unfortunately, you kind of have to have those things because that's the only way that, you know, a multicultural society can push forward, is when white people stop being self-centered and realize other people exist.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, but I also think that to a point, it's actually detrimental to have them continually see people of color and like marginalized people go through trauma, because then that's all they associate us with. And they don't see us as people, they like see us as our struggles, you know? And like the only time that they don't see us struggling is in comedies. And then they think either we're like dying and fighting against racism or we're just fucking hilarious. And wow, that is true. It prevents them from like empathizing with us fully on like a human level, you know?
I 100% agree with that. But I also think, you know, Black people are guilty of that too. Like, I don't want to see Black trauma porn. Like, I don't care.
100%.
Black person, I don't care. Like, I don't want to see it. Like, as a Black person, I don't define myself wholly in contrast to white people. And I feel like that's what a lot of Black art is, unfortunately. It's either talking about trauma or talking about how to fit in with white people or worried about fit. Like, to me, I don't care about that. Like, all of my pilots have Black women as protagonists, but it's never a racially focused story. I feel like me as a Black woman, obviously there's going to be aspects of racism that is naturally filter into me. That's just how it is. But I don't, like, it's like a fish doesn't know it's in water because that's all that's around. So for me, I'm a Black woman. That's just how I navigate through the space. I don't sit around all day thinking, oh, as a Black woman, you know, my trauma. And like, I don't think about that all day, every day. But I feel like a lot of art that I see from Black people is all about that. And like, for me, I am not my trauma. I am how we rose above that. Like, Black people are the most creative people, the most resilient people. They take lemons and make lemonade, to quote famous quote that Beyonce did not invent. We know that, but she elevated it. So I'll give props to that. So I want to focus on the lemonade, not the lemons. That's my philosophy.